Yeah, sorry. The Amendment 1 would put in place an appeals mechanism for pension scheme members where trustees have decided upon reduced benefits for members, and such appeals mechanism can ensure that any category of such pension scheme members have not been unfairly treated in any restructuring arrangements. As we know at the moment, that particularly with deferred and retired members, they generally speaking don't have a seat at the table, and the particular instance of that was with the airport pension, the IAS scheme. I think it makes absolute sense to put in the Social Welfare and Pensions Bill a provision of an appeals mechanism that any scheme member who feels that they have been disproportionately affected by any restructuring in a pension scheme, such as I used the example of the deferred pensioners in the IAS scheme, many of whom have had up to 60% cuts. And there I'm sure you'll have received correspondence, Minister, yourself on it, with actual factual information from people so they haven't had any mechanism to appeal it. There's been nothing bar writing to the trustees themselves and trying to state their case. It is a particular problem for retired members who are generally not represented by their trade union. Again, in the situation of the airport pension scheme, one of the unions was particularly disgraceful in that, where they returned union subscriptions to retired members, people who had been members for their whole working life, simply on the basis that they were trying to get the best deal for the active members who were continuing in that scheme. So I think an independent, proper appeals mechanism would be a way forward, and that's why I'm proposing this amendment here. It will mean that the other schemes, we can't have a position where schemes need to be restructured, and I argued the toss on the IAS scheme that I don't believe it did need to be restructured as it is, but that's for another day, that at least it would give some recourse to scheme members. So I'd be interested to hear your views, please.
Thank you, Senator O'Brien. And I know the whole pensions area, and at second stage we had quite a long discussion in relation to it. So I know this whole issue is very close to your heart, and you've previously worked in that area, so you've quite an amount of expertise in it. I do not propose to accept this amendment at this stage. I do accept the Senator's thing is that we do need to constantly keep the pensions area under constant review, but only recently there has been a change in the mechanism how we dealt with that, and I'll just go through one or two of them briefly, which is the Senator, because as I'm aware, you're quite an expert in this area yourself. No, I actually mean that genuinely. No. You haven't worked in the area.
Are you building him up, Minister, for a fall?
Never. Trustees must notify in writing the scheme members and any person receiving benefits from the scheme, as well as the trade union or representative groups representing the scheme's members, before they make an application to the pensions authorities to reduce the benefits. Once notified, the scheme members of those representing the scheme members are entitled to make a written submission to the pensions authority, who will consider any submissions prior to making a direction. Group representing the interests of pensioners and deferred scheme members have a right to appeal a direction by the pension authority to a High Court in the point of law, which very rarely would take. We've had that discussion before, Senator. Earlier this year, the Minister for Social Protection approved measures to facilitate engagements between the trustees of a pension scheme and a group representing the interests of pensioners and deferred scheme members. Now, there has been quite recently in relation to that, these are quite recent measures, but there's also in relation to is guidance to the trustees and how they have to do. So I think there is a need certainly for further engagement with trustees and maybe assistance and guidance. I do accept that we must and should keep this under review, and if the current mechanism proved that they're inefficient or incapable of dealing with it, we may look at introducing, as you're proposing, an appeals mechanism. But at this stage, Senator, I'm not accepting the amendment, but I will ask my officials to constantly keep this under review, and if it's felt necessary at a later stage, or even it becomes apparent that there is a need to put in that type of appeals mechanisms, we will come back to you. But in relation to this, we will keep this under constant review. But thank you for highlighting it and making the argument.
Welcome Deputy Noel Greenish and his party to the visitors' gallery. Senator O'Brien.
Just to respond to the Minister, whilst I appreciate his response and the bona fides of his response, the reality of the situation is that we have living proof of what has happened to specific groups of pension scheme members who have been disproportionately cut, and they have had no recourse, because in many instances, particularly with larger companies, the trustees, whilst being a separate body to the company themselves and the scheme being held under trust as a separate entity to the company itself, the reality of the situation is that all the weight and the power vests with the employers and also with current employee representatives. So it has not worked. It won't work currently as it stands. The IAS scheme proves that. So, you know, the appeals mechanism is probably because of the fact that the Shannon and the government don't want to see an amended social welfare bill go back to the Dáil because of the legislative programme there. I have debated this with Minister Burton at length, and you know, we haven't actually had any engagement since the wind-up of the IAS scheme. And I'm not taking it personally, but I don't think it's coincidental either that the Minister herself hasn't been in here to take any stage of this social welfare and pensions bill in the Shannons here this week, whilst I very much appreciate your direct engagement that you yourself, Minister, have brought to this chamber, and I know that you've listened. I'm going to have to insist upon moving this amendment. I think the only way of a proper appeals mechanism, if it's written down in law, any member writing to a scheme trustee in many instances, unfortunately, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. If the trustee of the scheme and the employer have decided effectively put a proposal forward as to what will happen by way of restructuring, it is happening, it's proof of it. Your officials know this as well, the department know this, the pension section within the department are also aware of this, and this is not going to be the only time it will happen, unfortunately, and I don't mean to be the prophet of doom, so I do intend to push this amendment.
You're pressing the amendment?
Yes.
Senator. The question is that the amendment be made. Those in favour say Tá.
Tá.
Those against say Níl. Níl. I think the question is defeated.
Okay. Amendment number 2 reads, and it relates to the State Airports Shannon Group Act 2014 is amended by inserting a new section 34A as follows. The IAS scheme shall not be allowed to close its pension scheme except where the scheme has reached a minimum 90% funding standard. We debated this at committee stage in relation to the general trust, where any scheme should not be allowed to be rewound should it have not reached 90% funding, and that would mitigate against a situation as happened in this scheme, whereby the scheme itself was run down over 2 years. The scheme deficit was doubled from 350 million to over 700 million in 2 years, and it allowed the employer and the owners, and at that stage 25% of the ownership being with the state, to write off a liability of €760 million, and from there then it was able to sell, the state to sell its stake and get 342 million odd on the back of the pension scheme members, both active, deferred and retired, who have all suffered severe cuts under this scheme. Now, it's a standard across most Western European countries, and indeed within pension standards in the UK as well, whereby a scheme cannot be rewound or wound down unless it's reached a 90% funding standard. That's a very important benchmark to set down, because currently, because of the Social Welfare and Pensions Act 2013 and because of the State Airports Shannon Group Act of 2014, every major employer in this country that has a sizeable pension scheme, and particularly those with a defined benefit scheme, are now being shown, here's how to get out of your liabilities. Run the scheme down, apply to the pensions board and say that your scheme's underfunded, pull the rug out from under the scheme members who've paid in, many of them on a compulsory basis since they joined the company, and reduce their benefits. Who benefits from that? The shareholder and the owner. Because they're selling it, and it's going to happen with other commercial semi-state companies. It will happen with private companies as well. The same advisers who advise the government and the trustees on the IAS scheme are advising other companies across this country, because it's the first time any government has legislated under the State Airports Shannon Group Act, the first time a government legislated to change a private pension scheme. Never happened before. And this has had massive ramifications for 15,000 families across this country. This will happen to tens of thousands of others because of the legislation that has been brought in by this government. As I said, the State Airports Shannon Group Act, the 2013 Social Welfare and Pensions Act, which brought in single insolvency. Not to detain the House, to remind people what a single insolvency is that where you have a profitable company with hundreds of thousands of, or hundreds of millions of euro at the bank, they can wind down their pension scheme and effectively extract their own liabilities from that overnight, effectively. That's what can be done, and that's what has been done. Whereas before, a double insolvency is whereby an unprofitable company in an unprofitable pension scheme, like Waterford Crystal, people understood in many instances where a company is not profitable and is making a loss and the scheme is making a loss, you have to reduce benefits and you can't pay out everything at one go. That's fully understandable. But we're allowing profitable companies shirk their responsibility, and we've actually set down the roadmap in legislation for every major employer, or small employer indeed, in the country to do exactly the same. And that's why I think putting in a stipulation on this scheme, because it's the first one, the IAS scheme shall not be allowed to close its pension scheme except where the scheme has reached a minimum 90% funding standard, is absolute, because it would set a marker down for others, and that's why I intend to press that amendment. I would ask the Minister one thing. What's wrong with setting a 90% funding standard? You answer me that. What's wrong with it?
Thank you.